So, hi, Mike. This is my video talking about my dissertation experience and exploration of self-efficacy in a teacher educator's practice. So, my dissertation has been done for 13 years, and yet I'm still always thinking about my teacher educator practice. And I think that that has been key to probably our relationship as research partners. So, I've been thinking a good bit about that. Uh, so my experience at GW was fantastic. I had a great experience. But it took me a while to complete my dissertation, and I think about that a lot. But as we were thinking about what was important in this work, I went back and thought about my abstract and what was important enough to make it into the abstract so that people would want to read my work. And of course, you and I have had lots of conversations about Jack Whitehead and his work and tying it into our work as well. Um, and I thought that was interesting that, he made it to the abstract. But I think what's most important probably is that I was thinking a lot about critical friends and what that relationship looks like as as we go through my work and go through your work. And you of course have your vested group, and I think you've added to the research body through that work. So yeah, so my dissertation, was really focused in on how do I know that I am good at what I do, and what kinds of proofs do I have, um, that show that I do meet the standards for a proficient, and I hope, better than proficient, teacher educator. And certainly my methodology was key to that, focusing around self-study and using self-study. So I think I'm going to move, in my work to discuss a little bit about my conceptual framework. So page 63. So yeah, so we'll scroll through and get to page 63. So yeah, it's funny to go back through and like do the comparisons. I had the Denson and Lincoln for qualitative, um, Baird's discussion on what should be part of self-study, and then of course Whitehead and thinking about living education theory, and then um, my work. And I talk about this is the first time I'll have studied myself as a teacher educator. Um, and so here we are 13 years later, and I'm still discussing myself as a teacher educator, and what that means. And certainly our work has moved into thinking more about leadership. Um, so that's probably the biggest change from that original work where I was new to teacher education, and now I'm an experienced teacher educator. At the time that I was writing this, I was um, on faculty. I was considered an instructor or a lecturer, and now I'm a full professor. So a lot's happened in 13 years, and now I'm running a doctoral program. At the time, I was teaching in the special education master's program. So there's definitely differences, and I can see where leadership is key. But yeah, so my work focused around, again, coming up with my own living education theory and thinking about the recursive nature of discovering your own living education theory, and understanding my own self-efficacy and where I stood in that work. So I've talked with you about this before. Certainly, Baird and Whitehead were huge in my work, but so was Anastasia Samaras, who ended up serving on my dissertation committee. Um, Her work has been just invaluable and key to my work. But I started with a research question around what are my beliefs about my self-efficacy as a teacher educator. And then from there, I was using a series of vignettes. So I had those vignettes and reflections and reframing statements and artifacts, all that were posed to my critical friend network, uh, that were helping me discover and do a qualitative assessment of my self-efficacy as a teacher educator. And then procedurally, it was a recursive nature where I went through 4 different phases to come up with that final teacher educator self-efficacy belief statement. I ended up by the end of my work, I had 23 different artifacts that I included. At the time, I was using an online storage system. Today, it probably would seem archaic, the system I was using, and there's probably way better ways to do this work. But I was also kind of judging myself or evaluating myself through ATE standards for teacher educators. And I was looking at things like student correspondence and faculty correspondence, my syllabi, papers that I was publishing, how I was building my coursework. All of that was used in that 4 cycle um, recursive. It was definitely recursive in nature because I was constantly updating those reflections and adding to and taking out to some degree. Um, who I thought I was, and that became my belief statements. So that just kind of shows that recursive nature again of those phases. And I was looking through the lens of a higher ed faculty, and so I had a teaching vignette, a service vignette, another that looked at professional development, and then the fourth was that research vignette, who I knew I to be as a researcher. My participants in my study were former students, former colleagues, and then current colleagues, uh, and that became my critical friend network. And then even though there was 4 rounds, there was actually 9 recursive steps, and steps 2 through 9 repeated themselves. So it took 14 weeks to just do the data collection to complete those 4 recursive series. Uh, and then we got into management of data. So I had a storage um, online. This was before the cloud. So I had wiki pages that were set up for individually for students. The students never, the critical friends never interacted with each other. They had their own wiki page where they would read my vignettes and then provide me with a reflection or a response to those vignettes. At the same time, I was writing reflections and then reframing my belief statement on the other side of that work. And where Samaris really became key was looking at her idea, or her 5 foci, which were personally situated inquiry, a critical collaborative inquiry, improved learning for the person involved, and then transparent and systematic research process and knowledge generation and dissemination. So I met that criteria in my work. And then I'm going to move into a little bit on my results. So the big overarching aha in my work was that after the first 2 rounds, within the third round of the work, um, my critical friends stopped reflecting so much on me and what I was saying about my work, and they started reflecting on their own practice. And so that was really exciting to see that happen. Um, and I think I can give you some examples of that. like I said, the critical friends were to respond to each vignette and then the reframed belief statement that I was submitting. And for a time they did that, but then there was a switch in those phases where they started reflecting on themselves as much as they were reflecting on me. So that for me was another set of evidences that in fact as a teacher educator I was modeling a behavior, I was modeling a way to be a reflective practitioner, and then my critical friends began doing what I was modeling, which was really exciting. So overarching, the CFN found that I was meeting um, a, a series of the standards, um, but I think if I was to go back and do this research again, I would look a little more intently at a few standards, standards 3 and standard 6. Particularly standard 6 looked at collaboration, and that's a key component in my life and in my work. So I wonder about that. Like, did that become a really important part of my process as a teacher educator after I was done this work? Because it stuck in my head that was an area that was not talked about a great deal. Uh, as well as um, standard 3 makes me think about standard 3 a lot. You know, you can see the standards that they did say I talked a lot about. Um, so yeah, I wonder about that sometimes. Like, did that become guiding principles for me in the rest of my practice? I think it did. And by the way, standard 3 was scholarship. Um, and I think, I was a pretty early career at that point. I didn't have a lot of scholarship. So I think that that was probably another reason why it was one that stuck out as an area of growth, an area for me to work on. And then I just want to show you once we get through here. So in my reflection stage, and again, I did this 4 times. Um, and I found the critical friends to be very, uh, very responsive, and it wasn't hard to take criticism. There was some, there wasn't a lot, but it gave me areas to think about where I wanted to grow. Um, and so there was statements like, um, teaching is one thing, a teacher's in control and that everything a teacher educator does is teaching. Um, every interaction is an opportunity in teaching. In my classroom, I state that I'm a proponent for inclusion and democracy. And so this became one of the areas I was looking to see what the critical friends um, said back to me. And so I got an idea from one of my critical friends about who's responsible for learning. It had me wondering about the difference between expertise and the role of a teacher. Uh, and I thought about, I mean, I just find it interesting that I'm still talking about this tension between American education and that struggling to resolve, like, who is the expert, and what do we all bring to the table uh, at any given time in any given lesson. I learn sometimes as much from my students as I do as their instructor. And I think that lends itself then to democracy in education, and kind of embodying what you espouse you believe in. Yeah, I think the other thing I'd like to show you in my work um, is this quote. If self-efficacy is the willingness to give it everything, to rebound from mistakes and to persist even when it's difficult, then I have that. The experience described in this vignette was a, a definite test of my self-efficacy as a teacher. And I was talking about that ability to admit to mistakes and um, to learn from your experience to do better. And what was very gratifying was that one of the students came back and said, it's very clear that Jamey has a high sense of self-efficacy. She believes in herself, her students, and her work. I especially like the fact that you could tell she was not boastful about her accomplishments, but glad about their student, and they were there, was referring to students, their accomplishments, and excited about the opportunities. So again, I was doing this reframing of my belief statements all through this process. And you can see with each round. And by the final round, I was saying things like, I have a constructive sense of self-efficacy as a teacher educator. I know this to be true from the successes I've witnessed in my students' classrooms with their students. And I know this to be true from the insights my students share in class. I know this to be true because I believe I can teach anyone anything because I'm willing to be a lifelong learner. And that's so true. I mean, here again, I'm 13 years out and I'm still living that and believing that. And I just, like, for example, I just had a meeting with a colleague who's going to be doing some supervision work for me. And I'm talking to master's level students, saying to them, look, we're not looking to come in here and do it, an evaluation. We're looking, in a more peer or or co-experience of what are the look fors that you want us to be observing. What is it that we can do to be helpful. So I'm still not in that vein of being totally comfortable in evaluating. I want to know how we can all work together to improve. And then this became what was the final um, belief statement that I put together. And you can see I had artifacts tied in. Um, but this is, again, 13 years out, I still every year look at this and update and change, um, because I just think that reminding myself of who I want to be as a teacher educator is important. And then from my findings, my first finding was around living education theory of the researcher as a teacher educator. And I did that for each of the areas, starting with teaching, service, uh, and then professional development and research. Finding two was really about the self-efficacy. And this was probably the aha moment with my students, where they really were starting to look at their own practice. And then finding three was that reflection within the CFN, um, where the CFN began reflecting on their own individual teaching rather than simply responding to my research question. Uh, and that was just really exciting to have happen in the midst of my research. And it validated my researchers' belief concerning teacher educator self, my own teacher educator self-efficacy. Um, and students said things about my vignettes, like the vignettes helped me understand why Jamey does what she does. It was very telling about what she thought was important and how she acted upon her beliefs. The way she wrote this as a story helped the reader be able to understand her better. Then someone else said, I feel as though I've gotten in Jamey's head and understand her perspective in a much clearer fashion. So even though I found out that vignette writing was very hard, uh, I do think for this study it was effective. Um, yeah, and so again, going back and reviewing this work, probably my big aha moment and what I want to bring and maybe talk with you about as my research partner now, Mike, is that I still think my research um, is viable and still impacting the work that I do today uh, as I've moved into a leadership role. And that sort of bore out when I went back and I read about some of the challenge of the assumptions. My CFN kept pushing me to have examples and to have artifacts. And so I felt like that has stuck with me throughout my work, that you need to be concrete. You can't just have a vision, but you need to be able to describe and give a vision that's tangible for those around you when you're trying to lead. So I've been thinking about that, particularly in light of some of the conversations we've been having lately. Um, so at one point I wrote that one of my professional beliefs is that the curriculum in public school is moving at a pace that only covers topics in the periphery and gives students little depth of content or skills, and that public education seems to have forgotten the theories of child development in our curriculum, and teachers are aware of this. And then I had one of my critical friends write back that the one thought I would like to leave you with is that your ideal of have great merit, but are still outside the norm, and that not all school administration may be able to embrace these concepts. And teachers are still taught in the politically correct formatting that then they struggle to provide that. And they were saying to me that I needed as a leader to provide guidance in those areas, and that classroom teaching is not as current as higher ed in our research knowledge. Uh, and so I think about that here we are 13 years later, and I think that is still as a leader something I'm talking about, uh, that there's a disconnect. So yeah, so I think maybe that's where I'm going to leave it with you, and I'm going to be interested to hear what you say um, about your work, Mike. So yeah, I think that's it. I'm going to stop there. Looking forward to seeing your video.